Hi there, so I'm Joel Chippindale and we need to talk about code quality. I was inspired to write this talk, to put together this talk, because of a tweet that Alan Holub sent out earlier this year. He said, one of the most destructive myths in software is that it costs more or takes longer to develop higher quality code. It's destructive because many of us fall for it in our teams, into this trap. And lower quality code costs us and our teams enjoyment and our company's money. So I'm going to break down this talk into three sections. Firstly, we'll talk about what high quality code is and and how we can be confident that it costs us less to develop higher quality code. And then I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why it's so easy to fall into the trap of trying to trade off speed and quality. And lastly, once we have a better understanding of the reasons we fall into this trap, I'm going to talk about some of the ways that we can help our teams avoid it. So first off, what is high quality code? The definition I think we should work with is that high quality code is code that is easy to keep changing. This is the definition that lines up with what we want, what our teams want, and what our companies want. And by this definition, it doesn't matter if our code is organized in a microservices architecture or a monolithic architecture. It doesn't matter if it follows solid principles. It doesn't matter if it's got 100% test coverage. All that matters is that the code is easy to keep changing. And so all of these practices, they're just different ways to try and make it easy for our team to keep changing our code. This definition also implies that it's context dependent. The quality of code depends on the skills and abilities of the team who are working with it. It depends on the processes you have around making changes to your code base. And it depends on how well it matches up with your company's and your customers' needs. I think it's really important that, I'm sure many of you will already be convinced of the value of high quality code, but I do think it is important that we're really clear on why high quality code is cheaper and quicker to develop than lower quality code, because we need to be able to explain this to ourselves, to our teams, and to others. The way I think of the way I want to explain this is with some made-up graphs. So this first made-up graph shows pace of delivery on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. And this is pace of delivery of a software project over time for perhaps your team. At the beginning of the project, you can see the pace of delivery is very high. It's a greenfield project. It's quite exciting to work on. You and your team are able to deliver features and new capabilities very rapidly. But as time goes on, it becomes more and more difficult. As the code gets larger and more complex, it's harder to make changes. Your team start to feel like they're wading through mud. It starts off maybe at their ankles, and then it's rising maybe to their knees, and then it starts to come up to their waist. And stakeholders are starting to complain at how slow development is. Let's compare this with the second made-up graph. Here in blue, we've put a second project. And this is one where there's been a lot more focus on the quality of the code through development. And you can see that right on the left-hand side, the pace of delivery is slower to begin with. You and your team are perhaps focusing a little more on refactoring the code as you go, on doing some more upfront design on how your code is going to be organized. Perhaps putting a little bit more effort into the tests and how they run. And the advantage of this extra focus on quality is it enables your team to maintain that pace over a long period of time. It helps your team feel smarter, and achieve more and feel more satisfied with their work and deliver far more for the company. Everybody wins. Now, I've not put any units on these graphs, but in my experience, that point where it crosses over, where high quality code becomes more productive to work on high quality code than low quality code, happens very early on in your work, much earlier than you expect. Typically minutes or hours or days, definitely sooner than months or years. These graphs are also heavily simplified. They're not real software development projects. And they're simplified by imagining you just make a single decision at the beginning of the project to do higher quality code or lower quality code. However, in practice, your team has this decision every time they make changes to the code base. So it's many, many decisions. And if you think about your code base, it's probably a more complex picture than this. And sometimes the code quality will have gone up. I want us to take a little moment to reflect on our teams and our code bases. If you want, share some of your reflections in the comments. How long has your code base been around? How long do you expect it to stay around? What would this graph look like for your team and your code base? How much are your and your team's choices about code quality affecting your team's effectiveness? What proportion of their time are they spending battling lower quality code? 10%? 20%? 50%? 80%? And if you just take into account their salaries, how much is this costing your company every week, every month, every year? Whatever your answers, rest assured you're not alone. I think the key thing to take away from this is you don't have the time or the money to develop low quality code. So if that's the case, why do we and our teams keep falling into this trap of trying to trade off quality and speed? I think there's a few reasons, and it's worth us going through these to help us think about how to avoid them. First up, it isn't a trap on the very shortest of timescales. Every time we go to make changes to our code base, we have the option of taking a shortcut and sacrificing quality in the very shortest term to be able to go faster. And then we have to pay this off cumulatively forever. And so it makes this trap very attractive, even though it only pays off in the very short term. The second reason is the dirty little secret of software development. And that is that typically maintenance of a new feature or capability far outweighs the costs of the initial development. But that's not what you'd see if you looked at the conversations that happen in a typical software development team. We focus our conversations on that initial development of features and capabilities. That's what we talk about in our planning. That's what we talk about in our roadmaps. That's what we talk about when we celebrate the successes of the teams. And our teams hide the maintenance they do. They fit it in around their real work. It's also counterintuitive. When we buy things in the physical world, we expect to pay more for higher quality things. If you're buying a chair, you expect a high quality chair to cost you lots more. And although it's different for software, we can't help but carry these ideas over. Lastly, code quality is invisible. We can't point at it. We can't show it to people. We and our engineering teams experience it, and people in the wider company and our customers are impacted by it. But it's not something we can point at, and it makes it hard to talk about. So if trading off speed for quality is a trap, and it's a really costly trap at that, how can we help our teams avoid that trap? Firstly, the bad news. Because code quality is something that only we can experience, that only we can work on in our engineering teams, we as engineering leaders are responsible for it. This is also the good news. If we're responsible for it, we can own this. Only we can make it better, and we can be in control. I have maybe 20 years experience making mistakes in leading development teams. So I'm going to share with you some of the anti-patterns that I have seen, many of which I have done, and some tips for remedying them. They're not exhaustive, and there are quite a few, but I'd recommend that you keep an eye on the ones that you recognize, and hopefully you'll find the tips helpful. First up, the people pleaser. Many of us are people pleasers. I'm a people pleaser. When someone asks me to do something, I want to say yes. I want to help. I want to avoid conflict. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be a problem for code quality. Earlier in my career, when asked if I can deliver a feature faster, I've often said yes, and silently sacrificed code quality in the short term. I've fallen into the trap, trying to please people. You may or may not be a people pleaser, but you almost certainly have some in your team. There are some things you can do to help them out. First up, the scout rule. The scouts have a rule, which is that they should leave a campsite tidier than when they arrived. And you can set this expectation around your code base. The expectation that every commit, every pull request should improve the code quality. Now, this is not easy. And I would encourage you to talk to your team and get to your team to talk to one another about what it means to have higher quality code in your particular context. This will help them learn and help them teach one another. Now, there will sometimes be exceptions to this rule, clearly. Perhaps there's a live site issue and you need to push something to production as fast as you can to fix it. And that's okay. But these exceptions should be explicit, and you probably want to set the expectation that they should be fixed properly afterwards. A second expectation that can be really valuable to set with your team and with the product team is to flex on scope, not quality. If your company continues to be successful, there will always be more good ideas than you have time to implement them. And so there's always going to be a bit of pressure to do more. People are always going to be asking, can you deliver this faster? And that's okay. But we should set up our teams to react by asking what impact we're trying to achieve and asking the question, can we achieve this impact by doing less? They'll need support with this. It takes skill and practice to have these conversations. But if they can have them, then there's a double win. They get to deliver the impact faster, and you and your team develop less code and higher quality code. It also helps to make it really explicit that we should be focused on the impact we have and not making sure we're really busy. The last expectation you can set. The people on your team will still want to please. And if you're leading them, they're likely to want to please you. So think about how you show what you value. How do you show that you value higher quality code? Your team will notice the things that you notice, and they will notice what you praise, what you focus your effort on, what you focus your attention on. Use that. A second anti-pattern that I've seen, and I've been guilty of early in my career, is the defender. As a leader of a team, it's very easy to feel like you have more power than them. And so with all the good intentions, you feel it's your duty as a good person to defend them and fight for them. Often you can find yourself doing this at the rest of the company. But this has some side effects which are not necessarily good for your team. Firstly, it implicitly sets up the rest of the company as the enemy. It suggests to them that you think that they don't know what they're doing, that they shouldn't be respected. It sets up an adversarial experience between the engineering team and the rest of the company. And people outside the engineering team will feel this. They'll feel like they're not listened to. They'll feel like the engineering team doesn't have their best interests at heart. And so they'll still try very hard to get what they want done. And so there'll be lots more pressure applied to you and your team. And what gets squeezed out when there's lots of pressure? Well, that's the invisible work on things like code quality. And we've fallen for the trap again. What can we do instead? A couple of years ago, I joined an engineering team as CTO. And I noticed that whenever the sales team were talking about the deals moving through their pipeline and progressing them, the engineers would tut and sigh and harumph. So I spoke to them about this, find out what was going on. And they said they were really worried that the sales team seemed to be selling something that they weren't building. And they were worried if the deal was signed, then they'd be on the look for huge amounts of work in an unreasonable amount of time. I didn't say, I'm going to go and defend you against the sales team. But it did seem to be something that needed addressing. So I did two things. Firstly, I went to my leadership team, the people leading sales, the people leading product, the CEO. And I highlighted this as an issue. Clearly, our strategy was not clear enough. And product and sales and engineering weren't sufficiently aligned. And so our work was to make sure that lined up. And that changed some of the things that sales were doing, but it also changed some of the priorities of the product and engineering team. And secondly, I worked really hard to show both sides that we were working in a partnership. So when sales talked about progressing their deals, I made it really clear that I was congratulating them, celebrating their successes, modeling that for my team. And I also worked with the engineering team so that they could show off their successes in terms of the impact on our shared goals, on customers, on sales, to help build trust so that people across the company would trust us in engineering to make good decisions to be lined up with these shared goals, to be able to spend time delivering on invisible work around code quality. Another anti-pattern that I have indulged in the past is the blinkered engineer. The engineer who only thinks about the outcomes for the engineering team. So I imagine I've gone to see the chief product officer and said to them that I think they need to delay their roadmap and all the items on it so that we can slow down and engineers can focus more on code quality so they can be happier. Put yourself in their shoes. How are they going to react? The CPO is likely to think, well, I'm a nice guy or a nice person. I like the engineering team. I want them to be happier. But if I delay the roadmap, I'm going to make customers less happy, sales less happy. I'm going to have a negative impact on our revenues. That's going to make the CEO and the board unhappy. What are they likely to do? So what would I do now in a situation like that? Well, the important thing is to show you want the same thing and you're thinking about goals in the same way. So in a similar way, I encountered this with a team I was working with a few years ago. They had a processing pipeline for customer orders that was a little bit flaky. And every so often an order would come through that would need some manual work from an engineer to fix it up. And as the volume of orders increased, as the company became more successful, this started to become a daily occurrence for engineers. And when I talked to them about why they weren't fixing the underlying cause, they said, well, we've got this full roadmap, and I'm sure the chief product officer wouldn't allow us to work on this. So I asked them, what do you think the right thing to do is? And they were agreed they should be fixing the underlying cause. We thought about how we knew this. What was the cost of not fixing it? And this we estimated to be about 3 days of a senior engineer every week was going into this. We did very rough estimates. And then we thought about how long it would take to fix. And we thought that 2 engineers for 2 weeks could probably fix it. We didn't know for certain, but we had a good idea. And we knew that the volumes of customer orders were continuing to increase. Taking this information to the chief product officer, it was a really easy decision for them. They could see that they would gain pace of delivery very rapidly if they went ahead with this. And the team were working on it the next week. Another anti-pattern that I've seen is the constant alarmist. This is not one I've done. I've worked with people like this. This may be someone who's leading on product or on sales, or maybe your CEO. This is someone who says, we can't think at all about the future because we're so busy this week. Everything is so important this week. But they said that about last week too, and last month, and the month before, and the month before that. It's a constant state of alarm. And I found it really helpful to ask this question. How long do you plan to keep being successful for people like this? Inevitably, the answer is years. And it can be a really helpful opener to talk about how are things going to be different in future? When are you going to want less from us? And the answer, if they're being honest, is almost always never. Then you can start talking about how this week, this month is no longer exceptional. The last anti-pattern that I see is the overconfident refactorer. When product managers come up with ideas, we help hold them to account. We ask them questions. How do we know this is needed? What impact are we aiming for? How can we break this down into small steps to reduce risk? But we're not always as diligent when it comes to our own ideas. And one of the really dangerous things we can do as engineers is go for a really big bang refactor. And I've seen teams that are 2 years into their big bang refactor and it's still not complete. And all the while it's going on, it's much harder for teams to deliver. This is a disaster, and a really expensive disaster. How do we avoid this? Use the skills we already have in developing products. Take an agile approach. Focus on the things that are holding you and your team back now from developing faster. And improve on them step by step, delivering agile. So we've covered what is higher quality code and why it's so valuable to us and why it's a trap to start developing lower quality code. And we've also talked about a number of the ways we can help our teams avoid this trap by building trust across the organization, by setting expectations with them and supporting them to meet those expectations, and by focusing on solving the problems holding your team back. Thanks very much for listening. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Hi, Joel. Yes, we do have one question that's already up on the screen, I can see. And I've got a couple of questions myself, and we've got time to grab a couple. Question I can see is from Luca that says, what is your insight on certain languages or frameworks making it really difficult to develop high quality code, and developers sometimes not really getting the importance of doing frequent refactoring, and how IDEs help greatly with it?
Oh, there's a lot in there in that question, Luca.
That's
Thanks for
definitely
asking.
more than one question. Definitely more.
So how about the importance of doing frequent refactorings? The first jobs I had were in kitchens, working in the evenings, working in restaurants. And one of the things I really noticed there is chefs who are working under enormous pressure to cook many meals in a very short period of time. And if they're running late, you've got waitresses coming and asking them, or waiters telling them the customers are waiting. It's a high pressure environment. But you'll also notice with them, they clean their station all the time. So they're cleaning their station before they start cooking, they're cleaning the station while they're cooking, and they're cleaning their station when they finish cooking. And I think as developers, we should be thinking in the same way. We should be refactoring all the time. We refactor before we start a piece of work to make it easier to do the piece of work we're doing. We refactor as we go along, as we understand the problem better. And we refactor at the end to make sure we tidy up when we're finished. And obviously, you probably know better than me that IDEs can really help with this. I tend to use Vim, which is less helpful in this respect.
One of the things I found interesting there, the way that you described it, is that that developers need to know or think of it as tidying up as you go. But how do you find that conversation goes more with the leadership team or for other parts of the business? How well does everybody else understand refactoring as a like you say, as cleaning the kitchen go? How well do you think that is understood, and what kind of problems do you think you see with that?
So I think there's two things there. So I think firstly, explaining the value of high quality code, and that's sort of why I went through those graphs earlier today. Try and get that message out to them and help them explain it. But I think there's a second thing to do there, and that is to avoid leaving all the refactoring till the end. That's really hard. If a developer delivers something and it's working, it's really hard to explain why you need to do more work on it. So I encourage developers to move that refactoring earlier. So again, the idea of refactoring the code to make the change you want to make easy, that's much easier to keep discipline on, because you haven't showed something working and then say, oh, but by the way, I've got 3 more days to work on this.
And just to let everybody know in the audience, we're having some technical difficulties in the background getting Frankie on screen with us for the next talk. So in the meantime, do keep your questions coming in, and I will keep Joel trapped on screen for a little while, and we can chat some more on it. So as soon as I hear that we have Frankie, we can move on. In the meantime, yes, any more questions, keep them in. if you don't mind, Joel, carrying on for a little bit and chatting some more, then while we sort things out.
Sure.
One of the things I often talk to businesses around, to teams around, is the idea of almost we call it a trade-off matrix, where we have, if you imagine one thing fixed, one thing firm, and everything else has to be flexible, and then down the side of it, then we put everything that we might be thinking of: scope, time, cost, quality are the four that I would put along
Yeah.
there. And that can lead to some really interesting conversations with people, because, it absolutely has to hit this date. We can't possibly move the time on that. And I really don't want to spend any more money on it than I already have. Well, guess what? That's your fix, that's your firm. And if everything else then has to be flexible, then you have to be flexible about the scope and the quality, which can lead to some very awkward conversations with clients, with teams, with leadership. So yeah, have you used that kind of style of negotiating and visualization before, and how do you think that fits into those conversations?
So I think that, I as I mentioned in the talk, I really encourage teams to focus those negotiations on scope.
Mm.
Or, when we develop changes to our software, many of them have no impact at all on the customer, on the business. And we don't know ahead of time which ones will and which ones won't, and exactly what's going to really have the impact. And I think encouraging these conversations, encouraging real challenge on that, I think is really valuable in teams. What's really going to make the difference here? What parts of this feature are really important to deliver? And so if you can have good negotiations on scope, then you can have things like, a fixed deadline to deliver. Absolutely. You can involve your customers in that. If you have you've done this with big enterprise customers, they think what they want is fixed scope, fixed budget. In practice, they want something that's really valuable and works. And as you work with them along the way, they're going to learn what really works. And so if you can bring them out on that journey, if you can show them the value that you're delivering and keep enabling them to make the best decision about what to work on next, then you can bring that value to those conversations.
Okay. A question in from Maxim, who says there are two versions of reality, where people work on good code versus the same, but where people work on low quality code. Hence the question, how do you quantify the graphs that you presented?
So those graphs are entirely made up, Maxim, but they do reflect my experiences of developing different code bases. And I know code bases, earlier on in my career, where I focused much less on quality, didn't really understand the much longer term impacts of that. I've worked on code bases where after a few years, it felt extremely painful to work on them. And so that reflects that graph that I showed for the low quality code. And I've also worked on code bases that even years into working on them, they continue to flex and continue to be possible to deliver new software. And again, that lines up much more with the high quality code. So those graphs I showed are graphs from my head based on my
Indicative.
experiences rather than
They're
precise.
indicative.
Exactly. But
Okay.
it's worth you having a think about, even on an indicative level, what does that graph look like for your code base, Maxim? What trajectory do you feel you're on with your team?
Apologies if you touched on this already in your talk, but I guess it leads me to that idea of there's starting a product from scratch, and you've set out as you mean to continue. Real world isn't like that always. A lot of the time you're picking up code that somebody else has written, and how you must have seen it yourselves. How many times do you start to work with a team and people take one look at it and go, "Oh, this this is rubbish code, this isn't going to work for us, we need to rip it up and start again, which never really works, does it? So certainly not from my experience. We are going to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but just before we do, what's your experience of that? How do you find working with teams on that kind of picking up something versus starting on something fresh?
So I think this is, and this happens with teams that you're working on a code base for a long time as well. In fact, it's one of the reasons I struggle with the term technical debt. I think technical debt can often come to mean any piece of code that anyone in the team would like a chance to do over, because they would do it differently now. And I think if you've got a team who's learning and improving, any code they look at more than 6 months old on their project, let alone from a new project that they've inherited, they will look at and go, well, I could do that better now. And they're right. That's brilliant. That's what you want from your team. But that doesn't mean it should all be rewritten. So I think the really key thing here is to really focus on what is holding your team back. Not what don't I like or what do I think I could do better. It's what's holding us back, and really focus the attention on that. What can we do to improve that? And that builds confidence with your team that you can make the code base better, rather than this everything needs fixing, everything's horrible, we can't do anything. But it also builds confidence with the stakeholders in the project, because if you focus on the things that can have the most impact first, you can show that the pace is improving. You can show the difference. So you build that trust as well to be able to focus more on it.